What really happens when the cameras stop rolling and the screaming fades? You see them on stage, 8 guys commanding stadiums with 60,000 people losing their minds. But what about the moments in between? The hallways, the airport terminals, the back exits of hotels at 3 in the morning? There's one person who sees it all and never talks until now. A former bodyguard who worked closely with stray kids during multiple international schedules decided to share what he witnessed, and honestly, some of these revelations hit different. Which member secretly checks on every single staff member before leaving a venue? Who's the one that made a bodyguard tear up without even realizing it? And which member carries a level of spatial awareness so sharp that even trained security professionals were caught off guard? These aren't fan theories. These aren't edited variety show moments designed to make you feel something. These are raw, unfiltered truths from someone whose literal job was to watch them. 8 members. 8 revelations. And by the time you reach number 1, you might see your bias in a way you never expected. This is 8 things a bodyguard revealed about Stray Kids members. Number 8. Changbin. The silent muscle who protects before being protected. You know what's wild? When you think of a bodyguard's job, you imagine a big dude standing next to an idol, scanning the crowd, making sure nobody gets too close. That's the protocol. That's the training. But what happens when the person you're supposed to protect starts protecting you first? That's Changbin. Changbin. Born August 11th, 1999, known to the world as Stray Kids' main rapper, the guy who spits bars with enough force to crack concrete, compact frame packed with raw gym-forged power, and apparently, the member who made bodyguards question their own job description. The former security personnel revealed that during a particularly chaotic overseas schedule, we're talking thousands of fans flooding an airport terminal, barriers barely holding, noise levels so high you can't hear your own earpiece. Changbin did something that caught the entire security team off guard. Instead of staying in the center of the formation where he was supposed to be, where the protection radius was tightest, he instinctively shifted his position to the outer edge. Not because he was confused. Not because he panicked. But because he noticed one of the younger, smaller staff members, a female coordinator barely 5 feet tall, getting crushed between the crowd surge and a luggage cart. Changbin physically repositioned himself to absorb the pressure from the crowd so she could breathe and move. The bodyguard said he watched it happen in real time and almost couldn't believe it because that kind of spatial decision-making under pressure, that's not idle behavior. That's trained instinct. Except Changbin was never trained for it. He just did it. And here's the thing that makes this even more layered. This wasn't a one-time hero moment that happened to get noticed. The bodyguard confirmed it was a pattern. At fan events, at concert venues, at any location where staff members were in vulnerable positions, Changbin was consistently the first member to notice and the first to act. He'd quietly move chairs so staff could sit during long rehearsals. He'd carry equipment cases without being asked, not for cameras, not for content. There were no cameras rolling during these moments. He did it because that's just who he is when nobody's performing the role of idol. The bodyguard described him as having what he called bouncer awareness, which in the security world is actually a serious compliment. It means your eyes are always moving, you're always reading the room, you always know where the exits are and who's in trouble before they even call for help. For a rapper who built his identity on aggressive punchlines and beast mode energy on stage, the contrast was jarring. The bodyguard admitted he initially expected Changbin to be the intense, unapproachable type off stage, the kind of performer whose stage persona bleeds into real life. But the reality was the complete opposite. Off stage, Changbin's intensity doesn't disappear. It just redirects. Instead of channeling that energy into destroying a beat, he channels it into watching over people. The bodyguard recalled one specific night after a concert in a Southeast Asian city where the team was loading out at nearly 2 a.m. Most of the members had already gone back to the hotel. Changbin stayed. Not because he had to. Not because management told him to. He stayed because the local crew, hired hands who would never see Stray Kids again, were understaffed and struggling to break down the stage. Changbin grabbed a road case, started wheeling it toward the truck, and when the local crew chief tried to stop him, saying it wasn't his job, Changbin just smiled and said something along the lines of, "It's everyone's job." The bodyguard said that sentence stuck with him long after the tour ended. He'd worked with athletes, actors, politicians, people who treat security and crew like furniture. And then there's this 20-something-year-old rapper from South Korea who treats a local stagehand with the same respect he'd give his own members. That's not performance. That's character. And character, according to the bodyguard, is the one thing you absolutely cannot fake at 2 a.m. when you're exhausted and nobody's watching. Changbin didn't just earn respect from the security team. He made them rethink what strength actually looks like. Not the biceps. Not the deadlift numbers. The willingness to be the last one standing so someone else doesn't have to stand alone. And if you think that level of quiet intensity is impressive, wait until you hear what the bodyguard said about the next member, because this one didn't just surprise the security team. This one genuinely scared them. And not for the reason you'd ever expect. Number 7. Lino. The member whose calmness made security genuinely uneasy. There's a difference between someone who stays calm because they don't understand the danger and someone who stays calm because they've already mapped every possible outcome in their head before you even realize there was a threat. Lino is the second type, and according to the bodyguard, that distinction is exactly what made him the most unsettling member to work around, not in a bad way, but in a way that made trained professionals feel like they were being outread by a 24-year-old dancer with 3 cats at home. Lee Miho, born October 25, 1998, Stray Kids' main dancer, the guy fans affectionately call the human cat because of his sharp, unpredictable, almost feline energy. Turns out that comparison isn't just a cute fan nickname. It's terrifyingly accurate. The bodyguard described a specific incident during a high-security transfer in a major European city. The team was moving Stray Kids from a venue to their vehicles through a service corridor that hadn't been fully cleared yet. Standard protocol in that situation is to keep the talents moving fast, heads down, no stopping, because an uncleared route means unpredictable variables, unauthorized personnel, open doors, potential crowd leaks from the main entrance. Every other member followed instructions exactly as briefed. Stay tight, move fast, don't look around. Lino did the opposite. He slowed down. Not dramatically, not in a way that disrupted the formation, but just enough that the lead bodyguard noticed through his peripheral vision. And when the bodyguard glanced back to check on him, Lino wasn't looking at the ground or at his phone or at the member in front of him. He was looking at a fire exit door to the left, a door that was slightly ajar, maybe 2 inches open, something the advanced team had missed during the preliminary sweep. Lino didn't say a word. He just locked eyes with the bodyguard and gave the subtlest head tilt toward that door. The bodyguard immediately radioed ahead to have it checked. It turned out a group of fans had figured out the service route and were waiting on the other side of that door. If the team had kept moving at pace without noticing, they would have walked directly into an uncontrolled crowd situation in a narrow corridor with zero barrier infrastructure. The bodyguard said that moment gave him chills not because of the fans, but because Lino spotted a 2-inch gap in a door while moving through a dimly lit corridor surrounded by noise and chaos, processed what it meant, and communicated the threat to security without ever breaking stride or alerting the other members. That's not idle behavior. That's not even normal civilian behavior. That's the kind of environmental scanning that takes security professionals months of training to develop, and Lino did it on instinct. But what really got under the bodyguard's skin, in the most respectful way possible, was Lino's overall demeanor in high-pressure moments. He described it as controlled detachment. Most idols, even seasoned ones, show some level of physiological stress response during crowd surges or chaotic transfers. Elevated breathing, tense shoulders, widened eyes, grabbing onto a manager's sleeve, all normal, all human. Lino showed none of it. His heart rate, judging by his breathing pattern and body language, appeared to flatline regardless of external circumstances. Whether they were walking calmly through an empty hotel lobby or sprinting through a basement parking garage because a crowd had breached the perimeter, Lino's energy remained identical. Same posture. Same expression. Same measured pace. The bodyguard compared it to working with a certain type of military veteran he'd encountered before in his career, people who had been in enough high-stakes situations that their nervous system simply stopped categorizing chaos as a threat. Except Lee No hadn't been in combat. He'd been in a dance studio since he was a teenager, training under JYP Entertainment after being personally scouted, then eliminated during the survival show, then added back because the team literally wasn't complete without him. His entire trainee background was pirouettes and vocal lessons, not tactical response training. And yet his composure under pressure rivaled people with decades of professional experience in threat management. The bodyguard also noted something else that stuck with him long after the assignment ended. Lee No never once asked about the security plan. Not because he didn't care, but because he appeared to have already figured it out on his own. He'd observe the advanced team's movements, clock the entry and exit points, note which staff members were carrying radios, and essentially reverse engineer the entire security architecture without ever being briefed. On more than one occasion, the bodyguard caught Lee No adjusting his own walking path to compensate for a gap in the security formation, something that should have been the bodyguard's job. It was humbling and, honestly, a little eerie. The bodyguard summed it up with one sentence that perfectly captures the Lee No experience. "I've protected people who needed me. That one didn't need me. He just let me do my job out of politeness." And if a member who basically made professional security feel redundant through sheer spatial intelligence lands at number 7, imagine what the bodyguard revealed about the member coming up next. Someone whose behavior behind closed doors was so unexpectedly wholesome that hardened crew members started requesting to be assigned to stray kids specifically because of this one person. Number 6. Felix, the sunshine that made grown men request transfer to detail. In the private security industry, assignments are assignments. You go where you're sent, you protect who you're told to protect, and you don't develop preferences because professionalism means emotional neutrality. That's the rule. That's what every bodyguard is taught from day one. But rules, as it turns out, bend when you work around Lee Felix Yo-bak. Born September 15, 2000, in Sydney, Australia, raised bilingual, thrust into the Korean entertainment system as a teenager who could barely string together a full Korean sentence, and somehow, became the emotional center of gravity for not just stray kids, not just stays worldwide, but apparently for every single crew member, driver, local coordinator, and security professional who ever spent more than 48 hours on his schedule. The bodyguard didn't mince words about this one. He said Felix was the reason multiple security personnel specifically requested to be reassigned to Stray Kids detail for subsequent tours. Not because the job was easy. Stray Kids fanbase is massive, their crowd dynamics are intense, and their schedules are brutal. It was because Felix made every person in the operation feel like they mattered. And he didn't do it the way most celebrities do, with a generic, "thanks guys," tossed over their shoulder as they disappear into a luxury van. Felix learned names. Not stage names, not nicknames the team used on radios, actual, legal, first names. The bodyguard recalled arriving on the first day of a 10-date European leg. Standard introduction protocol. The security lead briefs the team. The talents walk through, maybe a polite bow or a wave, and that's your interaction for the next 3 weeks unless something goes wrong. Felix broke that protocol within the first hour. He walked up to every single member of the security team, 7 people, shook their hands individually, asked their names, asked where they were from, and then asked what they usually eat for breakfast. That last question seemed bizarre until the next morning, when Felix showed up to the staging area 30 minutes before his call time carrying a bag of pastries he'd apparently coordinated with the hotel kitchen to prepare. Not Idol brand pastries with a logo on them. Just regular croissants and pain au chocolate from the hotel bakery, because the night before, one of the bodyguards had mentioned in passing, not even to Felix, just near Felix, that he missed having a proper French breakfast while traveling. Felix heard it, filed it away, acted on it, and that became a pattern throughout the entire tour. The bodyguard described what he called the Felix effect, which was essentially this invisible gravitational pull that made everyone in the working radius feel personally acknowledged. Local drivers who were hired for a single airport transfer, people who would interact with the group for maybe 90 minutes total, would finish their shift and tell the coordination team that they'd never had a client like that. Felix would sit in the front seat when managers weren't paying attention, ask the driver about their family, compliment something specific about their car or their driving, and by the time they reached the destination, the driver felt like they'd just spent an hour with a friend rather than a global pop star sitting in the back seat being chauffeured. But here's where the bodyguard's tone shifted from warm to genuinely emotional. He described a night during a Southeast Asian stop on the tour where the schedule had been absolutely punishing, 2 back-to-back concerts, a fan signing squeezed in between, and a dawn flight to the next city. Everyone was wrecked. The members, the managers, the crew, that specific kind of exhaustion where your bones ache and conversation feels like a physical effort. Most of the team had retreated to their rooms. The bodyguard was doing his final hallway sweep before shift change when he passed by the small lounge area near the elevators and saw Felix sitting on the floor, not on the couch, on the actual floor, with one of the local venue staff, a young woman who looked like she'd been crying. The bodyguard paused, assessed the situation for any security concern, and realized Felix was just talking to her. Quietly, gently. The way you talk to someone who's having a hard time and needs a human being to simply sit with them. He later found out through the coordination team that the young woman had been dealing with a personal family emergency during the event, but couldn't leave her post because she needed the income from the gig. Felix had somehow noticed her distress during the fan signing, while simultaneously greeting hundreds of fans, maintaining full idol composure, and performing his job, pulled her aside afterward, and spent nearly 45 minutes just listening to her. Not offering solutions. Not throwing money at the problem. Not doing anything performative. Just sitting on a cold hotel floor at 1 a.m, running on maybe 3 hours of sleep across 2 days, giving someone his complete and undivided attention because he sensed she needed it. The bodyguard said he stepped away from the corridor and didn't log the interaction because some things aren't security matters. They're just evidence that genuinely good people exist in an industry designed to manufacture the appearance of goodness. He admitted, with audible difficulty, that he'd been doing private security for over a decade and had never seen a celebrity of any caliber, musician, actor, athlete, politician, treat a random temporary worker with that level of sincere, unhurried compassion when absolutely nobody was watching and there was zero incentive to perform kindness. Felix didn't know the bodyguard saw it. He never mentioned it. It never became content. It just happened because that's what Felix does when the stage lights die and the real person shows up. The bodyguard finished his comments about Felix with something simple but devastating. That kid doesn't have fans because he's famous. He's famous because people can feel that he's real. And trust me, in this business, real is the rarest thing you'll ever encounter. Now, if the member who turned an entire security detail into personal fans just by being authentically warm sits at number 6, what could possibly top that? Well, the bodyguard's next revelation involves a member whose physical discipline and mental focus off camera were so extreme that the security team genuinely questioned whether this person ever actually switches off, and the answer might unsettle you. Number 5. Hyunjin. The perfectionist who never powers down. Most people understand discipline as a switch. You flip it on when you need to work, you flip it off when the job's done, and you spend the hours in between being a regular human being who scrolls their phone, watches something mindless, and lets their brain decompress. That's healthy. That's normal. That's how the overwhelming majority of professionals in every field operate. Hwang Hyunjin does not operate that way, and according to the bodyguard, watching him exist off camera was like observing someone who had made a private, unspoken agreement with themselves that rest was a luxury they hadn't yet earned, even when, by every objective measure, they had earned it 1,000 times over. Born March 20th, 2000, StreaKids main dancer and the member most frequently cited as one of the most visually striking idols in the entire 4th generation of K-pop, Hyunjin carries a public identity that's built on beauty, fluidity, and almost effortless artistry. Fans watch his fan cams and see Silk in human form, someone for whom movement seems to cost nothing, as if gravity made a special exception for him and him alone. But the bodyguard saw what happens behind the curtain where that effortlessness gets manufactured, and effortless is the last word he'd ever use. The first thing the bodyguard noticed, and he noticed it within hours of starting the assignment, was that Hyunjin never stopped moving with intention. Not fidgeting, not restless energy, not the anxious tapping that tired people do. Intentional, deliberate, almost surgical micro-movements. Waiting in a hotel lobby for the van? Hyunjin would be silently running through choreography with just his fingers against his thigh, mapping out transitions, timing shifts against some internal metronome that apparently never stops ticking. Sitting in the back seat during a 40-minute transfer to the airport, the bodyguard glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Hyunjin watching his own reflection in the darkened window, not out of vanity, out of analysis. He was studying the angle of his jaw, the way his expressions shifted, the micro-movements of his eyebrows, training his face the same way an athlete trains a muscle group. The bodyguard said he'd seen professional actors do similar things before red carpet events, a quick mirror check, a practice smile, maybe 30 seconds of self-review. Hyunjin did it for the entire 40-minute drive, in complete silence, with a focus so dense it felt like the air around him had weight. But the revelation that truly shook the security team happened during a rest day, one of those rare, precious 24-hour windows in a touring schedule where there are zero obligations, zero appearances, zero reasons to be anything other than a tired young man in a hotel room ordering room service. The bodyguard was stationed on the floor for standard overnight security, doing periodic hallway checks every 90 minutes. On his 2 a.m. sweep, he passed Hyunjin's door and heard music playing softly inside. Not unusual, lots of people fall asleep with music on. On his 3:30 a.m. sweep, the music was still playing, but now he could hear faint rhythmic sounds. Footwork. At 3:30 in the morning. On a rest day. He paused and listened for about 15 seconds, enough to confirm it wasn't a TV or a video playing from a phone. It was live. It was Hyunjin, alone in his hotel room in the dead of night, dancing. Not casually moving around. Drilling choreography. The bodyguard could hear the precision of the stops, the controlled breathing between phrases, the deliberate repetition of specific sequences over and over and over. He did his 5 a.m. sweep 4 hours before the next schedule was due to begin. The music was still playing. The footwork had not stopped. 3.5 hours of solitary practice in a dark hotel room while the rest of the world slept, and when Hyunjin emerged for breakfast that morning, he looked completely composed, fully styled, and ready for the day's events as if he'd slept a full 8 hours. The bodyguard said he felt a strange mix of admiration and genuine concern, because what he witnessed wasn't just work ethic, it was something closer to obsession. The kind of relentless internal standard that doesn't negotiate with fatigue or schedule or common sense. And it extended beyond dance. The bodyguard learned through casual observation that Hyunjin carried a small sketchbook with him almost everywhere, tucked into a jacket pocket, slid into the side of a bag, always within arm's reach. During downtimes that other members spent sleeping or gaming or talking, Hyunjin would pull out that sketchbook and draw. Not doodles. Not idle scribbles to pass the time. Detailed, layered compositions that he would work on across multiple sessions, sometimes flipping back to a page from days earlier to refine a shadow or adjust a proportion. The bodyguard once caught a brief glimpse of a page. He stressed he wasn't snooping. The book was open on a table during a venue walkthrough, and said the level of technical skill was legitimately impressive. The kind of work you'd expect from someone enrolled in a fine arts program, not a 20-something idol between soundcheck and a concert for 50,000 people. The bodyguard reflected on Hyunjin's nature with a comparison that resonated deeply. He said most artists he'd worked with treated their craft like a job. You show up, you deliver, you go home. A rare few treated it like a calling, something that defined their schedule and their priorities. Hyunjin treated it like breathing. Not something he chose to do, not something he could stop doing, but something that continued involuntarily whether he was on stage, in a van, in a hotel room at 3 a.m., or sitting in a makeup chair waiting for concealer to set. It wasn't performance. It wasn't hustle culture. It was simply the way his internal architecture was wired to create, refine, repeat, and never once consider the possibility of good enough. The bodyguard ended his observations about Hyunjin with a quiet admission. I've guarded people with talent. I've guarded people with discipline. I've never guarded someone where I genuinely couldn't tell where the person ended and the art began. With him, I'm not sure there's a line. And if an artist who literally cannot separate himself from his craft, even in sleep, even in rest, even in the smallest invisible moments, sits at number 5, then what did the bodyguard witness from the next member that ranked even higher? Here's a hint. It involves a voice, a moment of complete emotional vulnerability backstage, and a reaction from the crew that nobody saw coming. Number 4, Han, the voice that broke a room full of people who don't break. Backstage at a major concert is one of the least romantic places on earth. Forget the glamour you imagine. It's fluorescent lighting, concrete floors, tangled cable runs, plastic-wrapped catering trays that stopped being warm 2 hours ago, and the constant hiss of walkies-talkies cutting through every conversation. It's a workspace. A factory floor with better costumes. The people who operate in that space, riggers, sound engineers, stage managers, security, are professionals who have seen everything. They've worked with legends, watched careers implode and explode in the same night, stood 3 feet from some of the most emotionally charged performances in modern entertainment, and felt nothing because feeling something is a liability when your job requires mechanical precision. These are people who do not crack. Until Han Ji-sung sat on a flight case in a corridor behind stage right and started singing to himself, and every single person within earshot stopped what they were doing. Born September 14, 2000, one of Stray Kids' main rappers, a core vocalist, and 1/3 of the production unit 3 Racha alongside Bang Chan and Changbin, Han carries a professional resume that would be absurd for someone twice his age. Writer, composer, lyricist, rapper, vocalist, performer. He's been building songs from the ground up since before Stray Kids even officially debuted in 2018, pouring pieces of himself into tracks that have defined an entire generation's emotional vocabulary. But the bodyguard wasn't talking about Han the producer, or Han the rapper, or Han the guy who can switch between vocal honey and lyrical venom in the same bar. He was talking about Han the person, the version that exists when the title cards disappear and there's nothing left but a young man, an empty hallway, and whatever's sitting in his chest that needs to come out. The bodyguard set the scene carefully because he wanted the weight of it to land. It was roughly 2 hours before a stadium show, one of the bigger dates on the tour, the kind of venue where the backstage area alone is the size of a regular concert hall. The energy was high but controlled, the organized chaos of 60-plus crew members executing a rehearsed production sequence they'd done dozens of times. Han had finished his soundcheck early and was told he had about 90 minutes of free time before hair and makeup. Most members used that window to rest, eat, or scroll through their phones in their designated rooms. Han didn't go to his room. He wandered. The bodyguard, assigned to shadow him for the shift, followed at a professional distance as Han moved through the backstage labyrinth without any apparent destination. Past the wardrobe department. Past the instrument storage. Past the loading dock where trucks were still being unloaded. He eventually ended up in a narrow service corridor that connected the backstage area to an emergency exit, the kind of hallway that exists in every arena but nobody ever uses because it leads nowhere useful. Han sat down on a black flight case parked against the wall, pulled his knees up to his chest, and just sat there for a moment. The bodyguard positioned himself at the end of the corridor, close enough to maintain visual contact, far enough to give privacy. And then Han started singing. Not rehearsing. Not running through setlist tracks or warming up his vocals for the show. Singing something the bodyguard didn't recognize, something slow, something raw, something that sounded like it was being composed in real time, words forming and dissolving as Han tested melodies against emotions that didn't have language yet. The bodyguard described the sound as a voice that didn't know it was being heard, and said that distinction is everything. Because the voice Han uses on stage, powerful, controlled, technically precise, is a performance instrument calibrated for 60,000 ears. The voice in that corridor was something else entirely. It was unguarded. It cracked in places where a trained vocalist would normally smooth it out. It wavered on notes that Han could absolutely hit with surgical accuracy if he wanted to. But he wasn't trying to be accurate. He was trying to be honest. And that honesty is what stopped people in their tracks. A cable runner heading to the stage with a coil of XLR over his shoulder paused at the corridor entrance, listened for about 10 seconds, and quietly set the cable down on the floor so the metal connectors wouldn't make noise. A lighting technician coming from the opposite direction did the same thing. Within 3 or 4 minutes, there were 5 or 6 crew members silently gathered at both ends of that corridor, not watching, because most of them couldn't even see Han from their positions, just listening. Nobody spoke. Nobody recorded it. Nobody reached for a phone. They just stood there, hardened touring professionals with decades of combined experience, letting a 20-something kid's unpolished, unrehearsed, unnamed song wash over them in a concrete hallway that smelled like diesel and dust. The bodyguard said one of the riggers, a man in his 50s who'd been touring with major acts since the 90s and had a reputation for being the most emotionally impenetrable person on any crew, was standing at the far end of the corridor with his arms crossed and his head tilted back against the wall, and his eyes were wet. Not crying. Not weeping. Just wet. The kind of involuntary physiological response that happens when something bypasses every defense mechanism you've built over 30 years of professional detachment and touches something you forgot was still there. Han sang for maybe 12 minutes. When he stopped, he sat quietly for another moment, hopped off the flight case, and walked back toward the dressing rooms as if nothing had happened. He never saw the small crowd. He never knew the impact. The crew members dispersed silently, picked up their cables and their tools, and went back to work without saying a word to each other about what had just occurred. The bodyguard said he didn't bring it up with anyone on the team for the rest of the tour. It felt like something that would lose its power if it was discussed or analyzed or turned into an anecdote. But he also said it was the single moment during his entire assignment with Stray Kids that fundamentally changed his understanding of what an artist actually is. Not someone who performs emotion. Someone who contains so much of it that it leaks out involuntarily in empty hallways when they think no one is there. He said Han carries something heavy, the kind of emotional depth that fuels extraordinary art, but also demands extraordinary endurance from the person housing it. The bodyguard had read about Han's well-documented struggles with anxiety, his honest public discussions about mental health, his openness about the weight of being perceived by millions. And he said witnessing that corridor moment made all of those public statements feel less like celebrity vulnerability branding and more like genuine survival dispatches from someone who processes the entire world at a frequency most people will never experience. That kid doesn't just write music, the bodyguard said. He bleeds it. And the scariest part is, I don't think he knows how to stop. Now, if a moment of raw, unguarded emotion powerful enough to silence a room full of unshakable professionals sits at number 4, what revelation could the bodyguard possibly have about the next member that ranks above it? Let's just say it involves something the bodyguard witnessed during the most dangerous 30 seconds of the entire tour, and the member who stepped into that chaos with a decision that changed everything. Number 3, Bang Chan, the leader who moved before security did. 30 seconds. That's all it takes for a controlled situation to become a disaster. In the private security world, 30 seconds is an eternity, enough time for a crowd barrier to collapse, enough time for a formation to break, enough time for someone to get hurt in a way that can't be undone. Every bodyguard trains for those 30 seconds. They drill it. They simulate it. They rehearse their response to chaos so many times that when the real thing happens, muscle memory takes over and rational thought becomes a luxury you handle after the threat is neutralized. The bodyguard had been through those 30-second windows before, with athletes, with diplomats, with public figures whose safety profiles required military-grade protocols. He knew what those moments looked like. He knew what they felt like. And he said, without hesitation, that the most critical 30 seconds of his entire Stray Kids assignment belonged to Bang Chan, not because Chan was the one in danger, but because Chan was the one who eliminated the danger before trained professionals could even process what was happening. Christopher Bang Chan, born October 3, 1997, in Sydney, Australia. Leader of Stray Kids. Head of 3 Racha. 7-year JYP Entertainment trainee. The man who built this group from the inside out, who hand-selected members, who fought for their creative independence when they were barely legal adults in an industry that treats young artists like interchangeable product, who has openly carried the emotional weight of 7 other human beings on his shoulders since he was 20 years old and has never once publicly wavered under that pressure. Fans know him as the leader who stays up until dawn producing music. They know him as the guy who runs Chan's room lives at midnight just to talk to Stays, because he genuinely can't sleep knowing someone out there might need to hear his voice. They know the curated version of his leadership, warm, steady, reliable, the older brother archetype executed to perfection. The bodyguard knew a different version. The version that operates on raw instinct when the architecture of safety collapses in real time. The incident happened during an outdoor festival appearance in Asia, one of those multi-act events where crowd control is exponentially harder because you're dealing with mixed fan bases, open-air sight lines, temporary infrastructure, and weather variables that indoor venues don't have. Stray Kids had just finished their set and were being escorted from the stage to a secured vehicle area through a designated pathway separated from the general crowd by metal barricades and a line of event security. Standard extraction. Textbook stuff. Except the barricade system at one specific junction point, a 90-degree turn where the pathway narrowed, had been compromised. Not breached by fans. Structurally compromised. One of the base plates had shifted on the uneven ground, and the weight of the crowd pressing against it from the other side had created a slow-motion mechanical failure that nobody on the advance team had caught because the barricade still looked intact from the secured side. The bodyguard was in the lead position, walking point approximately 4 meters ahead of the group, scanning forward for route clearance. Chan was at the back of the member formation, his usual position, the bodyguard noted, because Chan always placed himself at the rear so he could see all 7 members in front of him. That positioning wasn't a coincidence or a habit. It was a deliberate leadership architecture. Chan engineered his own physical placement within the group to maximize his visual coverage of his members at all times. The bodyguard had recognized this pattern within the first day of the assignment and privately respected it because it mirrored exactly how a team leader in a close protection unit would position themselves. When the barricade section at the junction point gave way, it didn't collapse dramatically like it does in videos you see online. It buckled. A slow, grinding shift inward that compressed the pathway by about 3 feet in the span of maybe 2 seconds, and suddenly the gap between the secured route and hundreds of surging fans went from adequate to almost non-existent. The bodyguard, for meters ahead, heard the metal grind, turned, and began moving back toward the group. His training kicked in: assess, reposition, evacuate. He estimated he needed about 4 seconds to close the distance and redirect the members around the compromised section. Chan did it in 1. The bodyguard said, and he repeated this detail twice to make sure it was understood. Chan reacted before the barricade had even finished moving. Not after. Not simultaneously. Before. As if his body had registered the structural failure through vibration or sound at a frequency the bodyguard's own trained senses hadn't picked up yet. In a single fluid motion, Chan stepped out of his rear position, extended both arms wide, and physically swept the 3 members closest to the compromised section. The bodyguard didn't name who they were, forward and to the inside of the pathway, away from the buckling barricade, using his own body as a barrier between them and the gap. He didn't shout. He didn't freeze. He didn't look to security for instructions. He moved with the kind of automatic, zero hesitation decisiveness that the bodyguard said he had only ever seen in 2 categories of people: parents protecting their children and soldiers protecting their unit. Chan held that position, arms out, back to the compromised barricade, facing his members for approximately 8 seconds until the security team closed in and re-established the perimeter. 8 seconds during which his back was fully exposed to an uncontrolled crowd, during which any number of things could have gone wrong. During which the leader of one of the biggest groups on the planet made himself the last line of defense with nothing but his body and a decision he made in less than a heartbeat. The bodyguard said that when they finally got the group to the vehicles and the doors closed, he looked at Chan expecting to see the adrenaline aftermath, shaking hands, rapid breathing, the delayed stress response that hits everyone after a threat situation. No matter how trained they are, Chan was already checking on the other members, one by one, asking if they were okay, scanning faces for signs of distress, making sure I.N, the youngest, wasn't shaken, adjusting Seungmin's jacket that had gotten twisted during the rush. He hadn't processed his own experience yet because his internal operating system doesn't prioritize self until every single member has been accounted for and confirmed safe. The bodyguard said he pulled Chan aside quietly later that evening, off the record, just human to human, and told him that what he did at the barricade was both incredibly brave and incredibly reckless, because if the crowd had surged through that gap, Chan would have been the first point of contact with zero protection. Chan listened, nodded, and said something the bodyguard has carried with him ever since. He said, "I know, but if I don't stand there, one of them has to. And that's not happening while I'm still breathing." The bodyguard went quiet for a long moment after recounting that line. Then he said, "I've protected a lot of leaders. Corporate leaders. Political leaders. People with leader in their title. That kid is the only one I've ever worked with where the title isn't a position. It's a reflex. He doesn't lead because the company tells him to. He leads because his body physically will not allow him to do anything else when his people are at risk." And here's what stays with you long after that story fades. Bang Chan was a trainee for 7 years. 7 years of uncertainty, of almost being cut, of watching peers debut while he waited, of building and rebuilding himself from scratch in a foreign country thousands of kilometers from his family in Sydney. That kind of prolonged pressure either breaks a person or forges them into something that cannot be broken. Chan didn't just survive it. He emerged from it with a protective instinct so deeply encoded that it overrides self-preservation, overrides fear, overrides every natural human impulse to save yourself first. That's not leadership training. That's something you can't teach. Now, if the member whose crisis instinct literally outpaced professional security sits at number 3, what could possibly be revealed at number 2? Here's what the bodyguard said. It involves the quietest member in the room, a moment so private it was almost never shared, and a single gesture that redefined what the bodyguard thought he understood about loyalty. Number 2, I.N, the youngest who carried a weight nobody asked him to carry. There's an unwritten rule in every group, every team, every family. The youngest gets protected. The youngest gets shielded. The youngest gets the luxury of being soft because everyone above them has silently agreed to absorb the hard stuff first. In Korean culture, this dynamic is even more pronounced. The maknae, the youngest member, exists in an ecosystem of care where the older members instinctively cushion the world's sharp edges before they can reach the baby of the group. Stray Kids follows that structure. 7 older members, 1 youngest. Hyunjin. Hyun born February 8, 2001, the member everyone calls the maknae. The fox-eyed boy with the smile that could end wars, and the voice that has matured from bright and youthful into something genuinely commanding over the years since their 2018 debut. Fans see I.N as the cherished youngest, the one Bang Chan checks on first, the one Felix wraps in hugs without reason, the one Changbin pretends to be tough around but melts for every single time. And all of that is true. But the bodyguard revealed a dimension of I.N that the maknae narrative completely obscures. A dimension so quietly powerful that it fundamentally rewired the bodyguard's understanding of what loyalty looks like when it doesn't come with volume or visibility. It starts with something the bodyguard noticed across multiple schedules, something so subtle that it took him nearly a week to identify the pattern. I.N was always the last member to eat. Not because he wasn't hungry. Not because he was on a diet or had specific timing preferences for meals. Because I.N would not touch his food until he had visually confirmed that every single member and every staff member in the immediate catering area had been served. The bodyguard initially thought it was coincidence. Maybe the kid was just a slow starter. Maybe he liked eating last because it was quieter. But then he started watching more carefully and realized I.N was running a silent inventory. His eyes would sweep the room when food was laid out, counting heads, noting who had a plate and who didn't. If a staff member, not a fellow idol, a staff member, someone the hierarchy of K-pop would typically render invisible to a top-tier talent, was standing in the corner without food, I.N would quietly prepare a plate himself and bring it to them before making his own. No announcement. No gesture for anyone to notice. He'd just appear next to a lighting tech or a driver or a junior coordinator with a plate of food and a small nod, and then drift back to make his own as if what he'd just done was the most unremarkable thing in the world. The bodyguard said he watched this happen at least a dozen times across different cities, different venues, different catering setups, and not once did I.N draw attention to it or seem to expect acknowledgement. It was infrastructure. It was just how he operated. The magne, the one everyone protects, had quietly built his own protection system facing outward. But the moment that broke the bodyguard, the one he called the single most private thing he witnessed during the entire Stray Kids assignment and almost didn't share because it felt too sacred to turn into a story, happened on a night that should have been a celebration. The group had just completed a massive concert, one of their biggest solo venues to date, and the energy backstage was electric. Managers were smiling, crew were exchanging high fives. The post-show buzz was thick with relief and pride, and that specific euphoria that only comes from pulling off something enormous. The members were scattered across the backstage area, some in the dressing room, some grabbing food, some already heading to the vehicles. The bodyguard was conducting his standard post-show sweep of the backstage corridors when he found Ian alone. In a stairwell. Not celebrating. Not on his phone. Not winding down. Sitting on a concrete step 3 flights below the main backstage level, in a section of the venue that had no reason for anyone to be in, holding a single piece of paper that the bodyguard couldn't read from his position, but could see was handwritten dense. Small text covering both sides, the kind of writing that comes from someone who has a lot to say and not enough space to say it. I.N was reading it. Slowly. And his shoulders were shaking. The bodyguard froze at the stairwell door, immediately running his assessment protocol. Is the talent in distress? Is there a safety concern? Does this require intervention or monitoring? He determined within seconds that I.N wasn't in danger. He was crying. Quietly, privately, in the way that people cry when they've been holding something for a very long time and finally found a place where no one can see them let it go. The bodyguard stepped back from the door and maintained his position in the adjacent corridor, close enough to respond if needed, far enough to preserve whatever I.N needed that moment to be. He stayed there for approximately 20 minutes. When I.N finally emerged from the stairwell, his face was composed, his eyes were dry, and the piece of paper was carefully folded and tucked into his jacket pocket, not crumpled, not discarded. Folded with the kind of precision that tells you the object is valuable beyond its material form. I.N walked straight back to the group, slipped into the celebration as if he'd been there the whole time, and within minutes was laughing with Seungmin and teasing Han like nothing had happened. The bodyguard never found out what was on that paper. He never asked. He never told the management team. But he shared his theory, and his theory was this. I.N had written letters. Not to fans, not for content, not for any scheduled release. Personal letters to his members that he carries with him during tours. Letters that contain the things he wants to say, but can't because the magne isn't supposed to be the one holding the group together from underneath. The bodyguard believed I.N reads those letters to himself in private moments as a way of processing the emotional enormity of what it means to be the youngest person in a global phenomenon. Surrounded by 7 people he loves with a ferocity that doesn't fit neatly into variety show segments or V-Live broadcasts. He cries in stairwells not because he's sad, but because the weight of his own gratitude and loyalty is physically too large to contain without release. And then he folds it up, puts it back in his pocket, walks into the room, and becomes the bright, laughing, fox-smiled magne that everyone expects him to be, because that's what the people he loves need him to be, and I.N has never once, not for a single moment, prioritized his own emotional needs over the emotional stability of the group. The bodyguard said something about I.N that still echoes. Everyone thinks the older ones carry the team. And they do. But that youngest one? He carries things nobody even knows exist. He's built a cathedral of loyalty inside himself and never invited anyone inside because he doesn't need them to see it. He just needs it to be there. He paused, then added, "The ones who carry weight silently are always the strongest. Always. And I've never seen anyone carry it quieter than him. The magne. The baby. The one everyone protects. Except when no one's watching, he's the one holding the floor up from underneath so no one else feels it shake. And if the member who's invisible, silent loyalty moved a veteran bodyguard to near reverence sits at number 2, then number 1 must be something extraordinary. And it is. Because the bodyguard saved his most stunning revelation for last, a member whose single action during the tour didn't just impress the security team, it permanently changed the way they approached their entire profession. Number 1 Seungmin, the one who changed how a bodyguard does his job forever. Of all the revelations, all the behind-the-scenes moments, all the raw and unfiltered truths that this bodyguard chose to share about working with stray kids, he saved this one for last, and when he talked about it, his voice didn't carry the professional detachment that colored the rest of his accounts. It carried weight. The kind of weight that only settles into someone's voice when they're describing a moment that didn't just surprise them, but genuinely altered the trajectory of how they see their own life and work. Kim Seungmin. Born September 22, 2000. Stray Kids lead vocalist, the member whose pitch accuracy is so surgically precise that vocal coaches have publicly cited him as one of the most technically consistent singers in the current generation of K-pop. The member fans sometimes call the underappreciated pillar not because the world doesn't see his talent, but because his talent operates so cleanly, so reliably, so free of dramatic flair, that it becomes the kind of excellence people stop noticing the same way they stop noticing that gravity works. It's just always there. Always perfect. Always holding things in place while louder forces get the attention. And that, according to the bodyguard, is exactly what makes Seungmin the most deceptively powerful person in the entire Stray Kids ecosystem. His superpower isn't volume, it's consistency and consistency. In the bodyguard's professional opinion, is the single most undervalued force in any high-stakes environment. But the story that earned Seungmin the number 1 position on this list didn't happen on stage, didn't happen during a crowd surge, didn't happen in a dramatic crisis moment with metal barricades buckling and adrenaline flooding the corridor. It happened in a van. A completely ordinary, unremarkable passenger van during a routine transfer between a hotel and a broadcast studio in South Korea. The schedule was domestic, the threat level was low, the mood was relaxed, one of those rare days where the security detail could almost coast because the variables were all controlled and familiar. The bodyguard was in the front passenger seat. The driver was local. 3 members were in the back, including Seungmin, who was sitting directly behind the bodyguard in the second row. The drive was supposed to take about 40 minutes through urban traffic, and for the first 20, everything was textbook. Music playing softly, members on their phones, the comfortable silence of people who spend so much time together that conversation becomes optional. Then the bodyguard's phone buzzed. A personal message, not work-related. He glanced at it instinctively, a habit he admits he shouldn't have indulged while on duty, and his entire demeanor shifted. His wife had sent him a message about a family situation back home. Nothing catastrophic, nothing life-threatening, but the kind of personal news that lands in your chest and sits there, heavy and distracting, pulling your focus away from the present and into a place you can't reach because you're thousands of kilometers away doing a job that doesn't allow you to pause. He put his phone away, straightened his posture, and resumed his forward scan of the road. Professional mask back on. Emotional compartment sealed. At least, that's what he thought. About 5 minutes later, he felt a light tap on his right shoulder from the seat behind him. Seungmin. The bodyguard turned slightly, expecting a request, bathroom stop, temperature adjustment, something logistical. Seungmin wasn't looking at him with a request. He was looking at him with recognition. Quiet, precise, unmistakable recognition. Without saying a word about what he'd observed, without acknowledging that he'd clearly noticed the shift in the bodyguard's energy after reading that phone message, Seungmin simply held out a small bottle of water and a wrapped candy. The kind of Korean honey candy that people offer when they sense someone needs comfort, but don't want to make the moment heavier by naming it. The bodyguard took them. Seungmin gave a small nod, not a smile, not a dramatic gesture of concern, just a nod, the kind that says, I see you and I'm not going to make this a thing, but I want you to know you're not invisible right now, and went back to looking at his phone. That was it. No follow-up conversation. No, are you okay? That would have forced the bodyguard to either lie or break composure. No performative empathy that would have made the moment about Seungmin's kindness rather than the bodyguard's need. Just a bottle of water, a candy, and a nod. The most precisely calibrated act of human kindness the bodyguard said he had ever received in his professional career. And it wrecked him. Not in the moment, he held it together because that's what professionals do. It wrecked him later that night, alone in his hotel room, when he replayed the interaction and realized what had actually happened. A 20-something idol, seated behind a hired security professional he'd known for maybe 72 hours, had read a micro-shift in body language, a slight tension in the shoulders, a half-second change in breathing rhythm. The almost imperceptible way the bodyguard's hand had tightened around his phone, processed it accurately as emotional distress rather than a security concern, determined that direct verbal engagement would be unwelcome, and selected the exact right response, silent. Acknowledgement paired with a small physical gesture of care. That's not empathy. That's emotional precision. The same precision Seungmin applies to hitting a note, to learning choreography, to studying a script before a variety show appearance so that his responses are useful rather than just entertaining. Seungmin approaches human connection with the same methodical excellence he applies to every other dimension of his craft, and the result is a form of care so accurate it feels almost clinical, except it's not cold at all. It's warm in the way a perfectly fitted garment is warm. You don't notice the craftsmanship because the comfort is seamless. The bodyguard said that interaction changed the way he does his job. Permanently. Before Seungmin, he operated on the assumption that the relationship between security and talent was unidirectional. He watches them, he reads them, he protects them. After Seungmin, he understood that the best people in any room are the ones who are also reading you, also watching, also quietly protecting, regardless of whether that's their job description. He started paying attention to his own tells. He started recognizing that the people he protected were sometimes protecting him in return, in ways he'd been too professionally armored to notice. Seungmin didn't teach him a lesson about kindness. Seungmin taught him a lesson about awareness, that true awareness isn't just knowing who's in danger, it's knowing who's in pain, and having the precision to respond in exactly the way they need without making the moment about yourself. I've trained for years to read people, the bodyguard said. That kid read me in 5 seconds, responded perfectly, and never mentioned it again. I've been doing this job for over a decade, and a vocalist in a K-pop group taught me more about observation in one van ride than any instructor ever did. Kim Seungmin. The member who doesn't shout about his contributions because shouting would reduce their accuracy. The number one revelation. Not the loudest. Not the most dramatic. The most precise. And in a world that constantly rewards noise, precision is the most revolutionary act of all. So there it is. 8 members. 8 revelations. 8 windows into who stray kids really are when the stages go dark, the cameras power down, and the only audience is the small circle of professionals whose job is to watch without being seen. Let's take a step back and look at what this bodyguard actually showed us, not as individual stories, but as a collective portrait. Changbin at number 8 taught us that real strength isn't about who can lift the most, it's about who notices the person being crushed and moves first. Lino at number 7 showed us that awareness isn't a skill you learn from a manual. Some people are simply wired to see what everyone else misses, and that gift can make even trained professionals feel like amateurs. Felix at number 6 proved that fame doesn't have to be a wall between a person and the world. It can be a bridge, but only if the person walking across it genuinely cares who's standing on the other side. Hyunjin at number 5 revealed the brutal, beautiful cost of artistry that never sleeps, a reminder that the things we call effortless are almost always built on foundations of obsessive, invisible labor. Han at number 4 showed us what happens when emotion is too big to contain. It spills out in empty corridors and stops hardened professionals in their tracks, because authenticity is the one frequency that bypasses every defense. Bang Chan at number 3 demonstrated that true leadership isn't a title or a position. It's a reflex, a body that physically cannot stand behind when the people it loves are at risk. I.N at number 2 broke the myth that the youngest is always the one being carried. Sometimes the smallest shoulders bear the heaviest loads, and they do it in silence, because that's the purest form of devotion. And Seungmin at number 1 taught us the most revolutionary lesson of all, that precision isn't just for music and performance, it's for humanity. And the most powerful act of kindness is the one calibrated so perfectly that it heals without ever leaving a scar. See you, stay. Love you.